Hey there, we are Rob and Joanna Tigan. Welcome back to the Growing Home Together podcast. We've been married for over 30 years and we've parented our 5 kids through all the ages and stages. We're excited to share our passion for caring for the soul of your family with you. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us on the Growing Home Together podcast today. Every week, Joanna and I receive comments and prayer requests through our website, and a number of those are from wives whose husbands are caught in alcohol and drug addiction. I just want to read one of those requests to you today to just give you an idea of what we want to talk about today. This letter says, Rob and Joanna, I am struggling with my husband's addiction of too many years. With the recent sobriety, he has been sober for about 6 months. Not too soon after he came home, he relapsed. This week, he's not come home for 3 days so far, with no communication. I was so looking forward to having a fresh start with us and our marriage. I've cried too many tears over this man, over our marriage, so many broken promises and lies. Too many times he's abandoned me. I am spent. I am heartbroken. I have anxiety. I have fear. I am stuck. I'm hoping and praying that he gets healed and that his addiction doesn't kill him. Too many times I have felt hopeless and wanted to be dead so that I wouldn't feel any of this pain. I'm so thankful and grateful that I get to have God in my life. I know that God sees all of this and he is right in the midst of the suffering. Hopefully my marriage will turn out for God's glory.
Yeah, that is just so hard. And, I know that the words of this message echo what many spouses are going through just in silence, as addiction is taking a toll on their marriage. And that is why we are so glad to have today's guest, Julie Sanford, on the podcast today. Julie is a wife and a mom of 3 who found herself in a situation she never wanted to be in as the wife of an alcoholic. Yet after God led Julie and her husband down the difficult path to his sobriety, she now helps other wives navigate their husband's addictions. Julie is a recovery mentor, and she's the host of the Married to Addiction podcast. And she's here with words of hope and just practical help for marriages that are impacted by addiction. Thank you, Julie, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. And, before we get started, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your family and how you became so passionate to serve women whose husbands battle alcohol addiction.
Of course. Well, obviously, this was a difficult road that I traveled myself. And that letter that you just read made me kind of teary-eyed because that could have been me. Like so many of those feelings, I just remember so easily feeling those, because even though it's been 9 years that my husband has been sober, it just was such a difficult time in my life that I can just be like easily transported back there because it just weighed so heavy on me for so long. My husband was actually addicted to alcohol throughout our marriage. I can see that looking back. It wasn't anything that seemed that big of a deal for many years until he lost his dad. And at that point, he kind of started a spiral that lasted about 3 years that resulted in 2 suicide attempts. And towards the end there, he was basically unable to even work because of his alcohol addiction. It was so hard on me, so hard on him, so hard on my kids. And it was the hardest thing I've ever been through in my life. So when he did get sober a few years after that, I just really felt called to help the women who now are in that same place that I was back then, because I felt so hopeless and like I couldn't find the help that I was looking for.
Well, what you were describing is that his addiction to alcohol wasn't an overnight situation for you and maybe for the women that you work with. At what point did you realize that he had just lost control of his drinking and that it really was a serious problem for him and for your family?
So there was a lot of, red flags here and there over the years, but they were pretty isolated incidences. Like maybe, 3 or 4 times a year, we'd have something where I was just thinking to myself, this isn't good. Like this is something that we may have a problem with. And when he got to the point where he was, incapacitated after his dad passed away, and, after the first suicide attempt, I really knew that it was like a desperate situation. But after the second one, they were just like about 2 or 3 months apart. It was like, okay, he is literally going to die if we don't figure this out. And so that was kind of at that point where I came to a desperation point in our story. But, there were some problems along the way that I kind of saw it coming, because it is a progression overall. Like, alcoholism tends to be a progression. It usually doesn't automatically get better on its own, but it usually does get worse on its own. But, like I said, when his dad passed away and everything just started to spiral, that was definitely when I knew that something needed to change, and fast.
Right. So for a wife who is maybe still in that wondering stage, what are some of those red flags that she might identify as there being a very real problem that needs to be addressed?
So if it's something that is affecting your life significantly, your children's life significantly, or your husband's life significantly, then I think that it's definitely, time to look into getting help for yourself. That can look a number of different ways. I do try to differentiate between when it's something that you just don't want him to do and when it's something that is really starting to cause problems, financial difficulties, emotional difficulties, things with like him missing work. Sometimes the husband will lose his job, or, get a DUI or things like that. Like if it's starting to affect your life rather than just be something that you don't really care for, then that is definitely a time when you want to, start considering getting some help.
Yeah. And, as you describe your situation, I can imagine it's hard to watch your spouse go through those kind of hard things and to make self-destructive choices, or kind of like you explained it, start spiraling out of control. So what kind of, questions and emotions were you experiencing at that time?
I remember just having so many questions. I didn't really know anything about addiction. The house that I grew up in, my parents didn't really ever drink. And so I was totally unfamiliar with anything about it. I didn't come from a background where I experienced that, fortunately. So it was all new to me. And I remember just desperately Googling, for answers on how to help him, how to fix it, how to change it. Like, what could I do to get him sober? Those types of things. And I just remember feeling just confused and lost, because I just didn't even know where to start. And it seemed like there was a lot of information, but also at the same time, not enough information, because I was in that like desperation mode of this needs to change right now. And I just had way, way, way more questions than answers.
That sounds really hard. I remember when I was young, still a child, I had an older relative who had been drinking to excess every day for quite a while. But the problem was overlooked because they were a pretty high functioning alcoholic, I guess you'd say. And it took a long time before the family realized that some kind of intervention was necessary. So what would you say are some of those common myths or misconceptions that a spouse might have about their partner's drinking, where they're maybe not really understanding the problem?
Misconceptions are kind of one of my favorite topics, because I fell victim to every single one of them.
Okay.
I think that the biggest one that caused problems for me personally, looking back, is that it was a choice. Believing that it was a choice made it all feel so much more painful, because then it becomes personal. You're thinking things like, if he loved me enough, he would stop. And the fact that he's not stopping means that he doesn't love me. And now I'm questioning my marriage as a whole. Like, is this even like a real marriage? If he cared about our marriage, he would stop. If he cared about our kids, he would stop. Like all of those things. And so it feels like a personal attack then, like every single time it happens, like he's doing it to you. But the truth is that when someone is addicted to alcohol, they have chemical changes in their brain that cause their brain to perceive alcohol as a fundamental need, like food and water. So at that point, the misconception that they can just stop for someone or something else isn't true in a lot of cases. And learning that really made a huge difference for me. Sometimes women will still say to me, like, how can that be true if somebody can still make the decision to go to rehab? And that answer is very multifaceted, but I actually did a podcast episode on that, I think last summer. It's episode 111 that explained it more in detail. But the bottom line is that it is not a choice. And when you view it as that, it just makes that journey that much harder for you as a wife, because you do start to take it personally instead of understanding what's actually happening under the surface.
I'm curious, if a spouse starts realizing that maybe addiction has taken hold of their partner, or maybe they're starting to wonder, what are some of the first steps you would recommend they take to address it?
I would say the first thing is to learn more about addiction. I did not do that. I was looking more for answers on how I could fix it for him or how I could help him fix it instead of really understanding like what was happening in the first place. So it kind of goes hand in hand with that misconception we just talked about. But I didn't actually really learn more about addiction until he was already in treatment. And they had a family week for us. His treatment center was about 2.5 hours away from our house. And so I drove out there, found a hotel close by to stay in, and it was a Monday through Friday thing where we would get up and go to the treatment center and, hear different things on different topics. And that was really the first time that I was exposed to what it was like for him, like a deep dive into what it was like for the addicted person. And that changed everything for me. And it ultimately changed things for him too, because he came out of treatment and he said it finally felt like we were kind of on the same team, because instead of it being me against him, now I understood that it was me and him against addiction and against, what he was fighting. And so learning more about addiction, I feel like hands down is where the wife should start, because it really just changes everything and kind of takes the blinders off. At least I know it did for me.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So in that recovery process, once you did kind of get on the same team and you, sounds like, started to identify yourself as one of his support system, what was the most effective kind of help that you were coming alongside with in the day-to-day then?
So at that point, he was already in recovery. So he did have a lot of tools, at his disposal. And I just kind of helped him utilize those. And I had a lot of the same understanding now, so I could definitely kind of walk alongside him with that knowledge that I had gained. But a lot of times before that, I was just trying to fix it. And a lot of the other women that I work with are trying to fix it. And I think just understanding that it's not your job to fix it is really a good jumping off point. I had always been a problem solver. So in my mind, this was no different. I thought, if I can just find the right tool or find the right key or find the right thing to say or whatever it was, that would really make a big difference. But again, when I learned more about it, that changed my entire approach. And at that point, also compassion started to come into play, which I think is important, especially for Christ followers. And when you are viewing it as me against him, and he's doing this to me, and he can make a choice to not do this to me, it's really hard to find any compassion in that. But when you start to learn more about what's happening on their side and you start understanding what it's like for them, compassion does start coming into play, and it really makes a huge difference. And of course, that compassion always needs to be layered with things like healthy boundaries and what I call it untying from the addiction. A lot of people call it detachment, but I kind of prefer the term untying because I feel like it's kind of more aligned with what we should be doing. You're not really detaching yourself from the person. You're untying yourself from their addiction and being obsessed with it and trying to fix it and all of those things.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like Rob shared in the beginning and like you've shared, you were going through a lot of pain and burdens of your own in that situation. So what did you need? What does a spouse need as they're walking alongside their addicted spouse?
So I thought a lot about this when I first felt called to start Married to Addiction, because ultimately the reason why I wanted to do that is because all of the Googling that I did and all of the things that I found, I just didn't feel like anything was for me. There was things for people who have alcoholics in their life, but there wasn't anything specifically for a wife. And our situation is different. Our relationship with the addicted person is different. This is our life partner. A lot of times it's somebody we share children with. And I couldn't find that specific help, which I felt like I really needed. And I also couldn't find anything that I felt was coming from a spiritual perspective of not just a higher power, but a relationship with Jesus, which was important to me. So I think that the main thing is to definitely dive into your faith. That is your pillar of strength through this. But on top of that, I think that spouses need to get some clarity about addiction, which I've already said. They need direction on how to handle day-to-day challenges and also bigger problems that living with an addicted spouse can cause. So that's where getting help for yourself comes in. And then also support for your heart, your mind, your body, your soul, all of those things, so that you don't feel totally alone in this, which I really struggled with. You just want to make sure you get some help. I didn't do that for way too long. And I tell the story regularly on my podcast of how I ended up covered in stress-induced hives for months. I didn't know what the hives were from. I thought it was a detergent I was using, or, whatever it was, a soap or whatever. And they just went on and on and on. I finally went to the doctor and she said, well, have you been under any stress? I'm like, well, yeah, kind of, maybe like every single day for the last, 3 years. But I was trying to deal with everything myself and I wasn't getting help. So getting help for yourself is absolutely essential and something that I can't stress enough. And I really wish that I had done that for myself much sooner than I did.
Yeah. And I'm guessing as a mom too, that included figuring out how to help your kids, right? What was a source of support that was the most helpful for you as a mom?
So for me, I really tried to just shield them from as much as I could, but I also can look back and see that I was unknowingly participating in the chaos that they were experiencing because I was taking things personally and I was trying to fix it. And sometimes my quote unquote fixing it looked like attacking my husband when I came in the door because he'd been drinking and it was off to the races. I had been thinking my whole way home about what am I going to do if he's been drinking again? And I hope he hasn't been. And this is just going to be a terrible night if I get home and he's already cracked some beers. And I would hit the door and realize that he had been drinking already. And I would just light into him and say, I can't believe we're doing this again. And, my kids were there for that. And so I wish that I could go back and do that differently. But I think that really is another reason why getting help for yourself comes into play, because first of all, you're untying from the addiction, right? So you don't feel like you do need to mention it and tell him about himself every time he's drinking, but you are learning to handle things better within yourself so that you don't have those times where you end up exposing them to things that are not great for them. So I would say definitely getting help for yourself is great in that vein. And I did not do that soon enough. And that's why my kids ended up witnessing some things that I wish that they hadn't.
You talked about just the loneliness and the isolating component that it can have on the wife or the family. I'm sure there's so many different feelings and emotions of taking those steps to get that support that you need. So can you share a little bit more what that looks like in terms of if a spouse is feeling like this is bigger than I realized or bigger than I can handle, I need support? What kind of steps can they take, and what does that look like to get someone around them and take those very brave steps of asking for help themselves?
So I would say start where you feel comfortable. In my personal case, I was very isolated because I didn't want anybody to know what was happening. And I actually find that is the case with a lot of women that come into my programs too. They've isolated themselves because they're embarrassed, or they don't want people to think bad about their husband. Or, sometimes in the church, like they feel like they're the only one who's going through that. And like Christian families shouldn't have problems like this. And so they don't really let on. So for me, like I isolated myself from all of those places because I had different reasons for not wanting to talk to people in my family and at church and in my friend group. I just wanted to manage it all myself. So I would say start with where you feel comfortable. For me, that was no place in my real life, which was why I was online looking for help, because I wanted it to be private. I wanted it to be something that I could just get on my own and not have to feel like I was exposed. And so that's another reason why I created a platform online, because that's another thing that I was looking for. Is I didn't want to talk to my friends about it. I didn't want to talk to my church about it. I didn't want to talk to my family about it. I wanted to just get some support for me. Now, part of that support does end up looking like you do need to, have people in your life who come alongside you. But at first, for me, when I was in that place, I really wanted something that was private. So there are online options, definitely. And there are, obviously people in your life who would be willing to come alongside you, but you kind of just have to start where you're comfortable at the time, I think.
I'm just curious if at any point when you did feel like you could start sharing it with the people in your life, if maybe they weren't as surprised as you thought. Do you feel like other people had already felt a little concern about your situation?
My friends, definitely. My family, I was not as open with them about what was going on. All my family lived in different states at the time. And so they didn't really have insight into what was happening on the daily here. With my family, it kind of all exploded because when my husband first attempted suicide, he disappeared for 48 hours, which was very unlike him. He was not a go to the bar and drink guy. He was a stay at home and drink guy, or sit in your car and drink guy. So it was very unusual for him to be gone. So obviously that was like a huge family crisis. And so at that point, I was just calling everybody, like asking for help, asking for prayer. So it did kind of like explode for me. But I do think that my friends, they did have some concerns. And I remember kind of getting mad about that when they first started talking to me about that, because I told them, I can handle it. I got it. It's going to be fine. That was back when I thought I could fix everything on my own. So yeah, I think that they did definitely know that things were kind of going sideways. But when the first suicide attempt happened, that's when everything kind of just blew up. And then at that point, everybody knew that we were full stage.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm just wondering, for those of us who are hearing your story and learning about this, maybe we're not in that situation. Maybe our spouse has a very healthy relationship with alcohol in their life, but they want to be that friend. They want to be that support system. What is the best thing that we could bring to the table with someone that we care about, someone whose significant other is drinking?
Probably start with asking them what they need, because I felt like nobody really was asking me that question. It was all like, what can we do for him, and how can we help him, and how can we get him into rehab and those types of things. And I was drowning just like he was. And so I would say, if you do have somebody in your life that you think might need support through this, just ask them what they need. They'll tell you. They'll tell you how you can best serve them. And if they say that they don't need anything or they don't want to talk about that right now, I would say respect that, but definitely let them know that the door is open and that it's a no judgment zone, which I think is really the important thing to say, because for me, that was one of the reasons why I felt like I didn't want to talk to anybody, because, my friends were all just saying, you better just leave him. And that was not where I felt my heart was at that time. So being there for somebody without being pushy and letting them know that if they don't want to talk right now, you're still there when and if they do.
Okay, yeah, that's a big help. I can also imagine that with all the painful losses that can happen from addiction, it could really shake a person's faith in God. What would you tell the spouse who just feels like God is so far away from their pain?
So that was definitely this whole period of time with walking through these hard 2 or 3 years with my husband when things were so bad. It was definitely the time when I struggled with my faith more than any other time. So I accepted Christ when I was 9 years old, and I had never really had any doubts of whether or not he was real. But I remember questioning that when I went through this, because I didn't understand why, as a Christian, if God was there and we were all drowning, my kids, myself, my husband, I was worried he was going to die, every single day. Why wasn't God helping me? If he was real, why wouldn't he help me with this? I have a really vivid memory of one time when I was in the shower and I just turned the water on so hot because I just wanted to feel something, because I was so depleted. And I remember at that moment just feeling like I was at the end of myself. I had no more ideas. I had no more strength. I had no more anything. There was nothing else that I could do, nothing else that I could try, nothing else that I could research. I was just worried that my husband was going to die and I was just going to have to sit there and watch it because there was nothing for me to do. And looking back, I really feel like God was there the whole time for sure, but he was waiting for me to get out of the way, because I had become the loudest voice in my husband's ear. I was the one who was always telling him what he needed to do and not do. And it wasn't really until I came to the end of myself and thought, okay, I can't do this. I just can't. I cannot fix this, that I gave the fight over to God out of desperation. And shortly after that was when things began to change, and when my husband said that he wanted to go into the treatment center. So I really feel like he was there all along, and I was kind of standing in between him and what he was trying to do. So that was a big realization for me, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's powerful.
I mean, it's hard, right? Because your addiction is so destructive, and it kind of brings destruction to everybody, right? Like you're feeling it for your kids. And so to find that balance of taking the steps that we've been talking about and yet not trying to control everything. As a spouse, how did you keep from growing bitter in spirit? If people are listening in that situation, how do you think you can keep pushing on and keep kind of learning those boundaries and things without getting too bitter in your spirit towards it?
I really did have a lot of bitterness for a really long time. A lot of bitterness, a lot of resentment. But again, it circles back to my understanding of addiction, and what was happening was not clear. And also my understanding of my piece in it versus God's piece in it was not clear. So that's another place where I feel like education is really key. And also being diligent about pursuing God through this, even if he seems far away, is super important, because you need to be both informed and connected to God to keep bitterness from taking root or, just hanging out indefinitely, and making sure that you are looking into both of those things on a regular basis and pursuing both of those things on a regular basis really makes a big difference, because otherwise you are just taking everything personally. And every time you try something and it doesn't work, you get bitter. And every time something else terrible happens and God doesn't fix it, you get bitter. So you really just need to make sure that you are learning and also pursuing God and understanding that he is the one who's responsible for it and not you. That does make a huge difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm hearing you say just how, trying to have discernment and wisdom and see things rightly plays such a big part. And, when we're getting messages or prayer requests, the women coming to us are often wondering, is now the time that I need to separate from my spouse because the finances are suffering or the kids are suffering, or they're just kind of at their end of their rope, like you were describing. So what advice would you give a spouse who's just wrestling with that question? Like, do I have to put space between me and my addicted spouse?
So that is something that's obviously deeply personal and very individual. So there's not really a one size fits all answer. I don't personally believe that everyone in this situation is called to stay. And I also don't believe that everyone in this situation is called to leave. I have seen both of those scenarios play out in the lives of my Secret Sister Circle members, which is my membership program. So those are the women that I kind of have a little bit more of an insight into exactly what's going on in their life. Some of them have stayed in spite of wanting to leave many times, and their husbands have ultimately entered long-term recovery, and life is wonderful again. That was actually what happened to me. I thought about leaving a trillion times and never did, because I felt like I was called to stay. I didn't understand it, but I felt like I was truly called to stay. Some women have left their husbands and gone on to remarry wonderful Christian men who are the best thing that ever happened to them. And I've seen that happen numerous times too. So I think the most important thing, if you're trying to make that decision, is just to remember to let God lead. He is the one who knows where he's trying to take you. He is the one who knows where he's trying to take your husband, your children, everyone involved. So that is really where you need to, again, dive into that relationship and pursue that relationship, even if it feels like you don't understand why things are playing out the way they are. If you let God lead, he will show you which of the paths that you're supposed to take. The only exception is, this is kind of like my one hard, fast recommendation. If you are in any type of an abusive situation where you are not safe, you need to always get yourself to safety first and foremost. That part for me is always non-negotiable.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And what would you tell the spouse who has lost hope that things are ever going to change?
So I was that person, for sure. I was in that place for so long. I think that the biggest thing is just don't give up. And don't give up doesn't necessarily mean don't give up that your husband will get sober. It also means don't give up on what your life is going to look like going forward. If you had told me back when I was at my most hopeless, which a lot of times looked like crying on the floor of my closet every morning, trying to figure out how in the world I was going to make it through another day, that someday I would be leading a platform for wives of alcoholics, I would never have believed you. Mm-hmm. I felt like there was absolutely no way I would ever have the strength, the wisdom. I didn't even know if I was going to make it out. I didn't know if my husband was going to make it out, But the main thing to remember is God is the great Redeemer. And he gives us beauty for ashes. And so even if your ending might not look like my ending, where you end up with a platform, I can tell you for sure that God has a good plan for your life, and he will never let you down. He is going to take you somewhere good. So as long as your hope is in him, and not necessarily your hope is in my husband will get sober, or this will happen, or that will happen. If your hope is in the fact that he has a good plan for your life, that is an absolute truth. And that is a pretty safe place to place your hope.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Well, you already told us that your husband has been able to move through recovery and just have sustained sobriety for a while now. As he grew stronger, in his relationship with alcohol. How did your marriage grow stronger? Were there any certain things that you did to kind of recapture the closeness between you or rebuild trust between you? Or what's happened from then to now, would you say, in your marriage?
I know this kind of sounds cliche because you hear this in other situations too, but having gone through that together just makes such a huge difference, because now when we have any sort of problem, it feels so insignificant because we've gone through something so heavy and so hard and for such an extended period of time. So I think that we now do a pretty good job of reminding each other, whenever something really difficult comes up. I just said this to my husband about 3 days ago. We've been through worse. We've been through worse. And so just that perspective really does make a big difference. And he's just learned so much and grown so much and, has just changed as a person too since he got sober. But it's just been really cool to see how he has so much more self-assurance and just all of the things that even before I recognize it as a problem, that I can look back and see that he's struggled with. And so I just really try to encourage him in those ways and, give him affirmation when I feel like he needs it. And like I said, just remember that we can do whatever we go through now with ease because we've been through so much worse.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, your story holds a lot of hope for everybody who is listening. And I am sure that there is a husband or wife who's joining us right now who just really is struggling to hold on to that kind of hope. Would you be willing to pray for them right now, that God would just meet them right in the middle of that struggle and give them what they need to keep going?
Yes, of course. Lord, I thank you for being here with us today. And I know that you see every single heart that's listening to us, and you know the weight that they carry. I ask that you draw near to those who are walking this difficult path. I ask that you'll bring peace to those who feel overwhelmed. And especially I ask that you will just remind them that they are not alone in this and that their healing matters and their heart matters and their hope matters. And I pray that you will please help those that need you to feel your closeness as you walk with them through this difficult journey every step of the way. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Julie. And Julie, you offer so many helpful resources on your website and great communities that wives of addicted husbands can get connected in to get help and support. So can you share a little bit about your ministry and where listeners can go to connect with you online?
Of course. So I do have several free options and also some paid offerings as well. My website is marriedtoaddiction.com. If you head there, you will see on the very front page, one of the things that is a great place to start is my free toolkit called the Turning Point Toolkit. And that is something that you can just sign up for and it's delivered directly to your inbox. But I also do have my Secret Sister Circle, which is my group coaching program, as well as a mini course on boundaries and a 30-day program. And also I have what I call the Secret Struggles bundle. It's more for women who are dealing with things like addiction, but also other things that are what I call the heavy topics that a lot of times people and especially churches don't really talk too much about, things like infidelity and porn and, all of the things that just really are the things that send women into hiding. And I have an option to support you there too. Like I said, it's called the Secret Struggles Bundle, but you can just head to marriedtoaddiction.com and you can find all of the resources and programs that I offer. And I do have my podcast as well, which is also called Married to Addiction. That can be found on pretty much any of the podcast platforms.
Thank you for that. And as always, we'll be sure and put all those details in the show notes so they're easy for people to find. Julie, thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been a really great encouragement. As Joanna shared with you before we hit record, we've been praying for the right person to talk to about this topic because we do get quite a few requests for prayer and things for this. And we really wanted to at least have the conversation and have a launching point, but we wanted to be able to direct people to somebody who could really support them in it. So we just really appreciate the encouragement that you gave us today and that you have available for people going through this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And if you're out there and you're going through this, I want you to know that I see you and you are not alone. There is help and hope available for you. Please reach out.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, friends, for joining us for the Growing Home Together podcast. Rob and I would love to connect with you over on our website at growinghometogether.com. You're going to find all kinds of resources to support your marriage, like our book, 101 Prayers for Mr. and Mrs. And we also have a free 30-day prayer journey that you can subscribe to right now to pray on your own, even pray with your spouse. At Growing Home Together, we're caring for the soul of your family.
And growing home together with you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Growing Home Together podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and found some valuable insights to help you care for the soul of your family. Remember to check out growinghometogether.com for more resources, and stay tuned for our next episode coming your way soon.